coming back this Friday morning. Thankful for the technical difficulties getting ironed out, and we have a presentation again, and just so grateful for Brother Patrick and his work on this, his labor to prepare this presentation, and then his willingness to share this story. So I just want to start by just saying I believe that all of us were probably stirred last week to realize the power of stories, the power of history, and the importance of not letting history die. And so just going to say that. So some of you have some stories that need to not die, and you need to be sharing those with your children and your grandchildren. And then others of us need to be listening carefully, that we might not make the great mistake of missing out on the important stories that are really instructive in how to think about our lives in the future. And so this is just one story of many. History is made up of many, many individuals and many lives and many ways in which the good Lord is a very good Lord. But you might be thinking about some of your family members and maybe your grandparents, your great-grandparents. You know a little bit about something, but you really haven't asked them much about it, or you maybe forgotten some of the things. Let me encourage you to take advantage of that while they're still living. And the next time you have a family get-together, or at Thanksgiving, or at Christmas, or sometime you're together, just take an hour and just ask them to tell you the story. And you might think about recording it. Have a phone there to record it. But let's not lose these very important stories. So that's all I've got to say. This is part 2. With no further delay, I'm going to ask Brother Patrick to come forward and share his story.
Well, thank you very much for coming back for part 2. Okay, let's all say this together, see if we remember. Le bon Dieu est très bon. My sister corrected me, by the way, so lest I become arrogant.
Which part did she correct?
Dieu. Le bon Dieu. She said I didn't quite say that right, so I probably didn't. Oh, yes, I was going to suggest that everyone ask questions as we go. Would that be better, or would you rather we wait to the end?
I do not mind, but there was a request made for those who watched on the live stream and recorded it that when we do ask questions, we use this microphone. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring the microphone to you.
Okay, so will we do it this way or not?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. All right, so this part is life under the occupation. Last time we discussed the Exodus, they're fleeing to southern France, and now they have returned, they're back home. The Germans wanted everyone to come back to the place of their former residence. So that's why they went back to where they did. And this is a picture of my mother. She's on my grandmother. She's on the left, and my mother in the center, and my grandfather. They're back in Hestier now after their exodus to France. A quick map here, and I'm going to circle a couple of places. This is Hestier, around in this area is where they lived. And today we're going to talk about some activities there, and way over here in a little town called Esneux, and then here in Namur, and also in Brussels.
I guess it's not a question. When we hear stories from the Bible, I always try to remind myself, Daniel, whoever, that Moses, they didn't know the end of their story. We do. And I'm trying to imagine being forced to go back home and how apprehensive and scary that might be, not knowing what it would be like, how different it's going to be. So that's a loss of freedom I just can't imagine, and liberty.
Right.
Quick question, the scale of that map, so these cities you're talking about, what are the distances?
Well, It's not very big. This right here is in kilometers. This is 30, the whole thing here is 33 kilometers. So Belgium is a very small country. It's 1/4 the size of Tennessee. So I think this would probably be no more than 150 or 200 miles wide. All right, so this was our timeline. Last time we covered these things. Now we're here. This is August the 8th. They've returned to Hastir. Additional things are going to happen here. The Americans won't be landing in Normandy for almost 4 years. So there's 4 years of time between when they come back and when we entered the war. And we always think of World War II, we think of the major events, and the landing in Normandy was a major event for us, but we don't realize these people were living under the occupation for 4 years by the time we got there. And they were also resisting and fighting. There was other fighting going on. And then Paris was finally liberated in August. It didn't take but a couple of months for the Americans to do that. And then more time after that, Luxembourg, and finally Belgium in 45. So it took a year for that to happen. And it wasn't just the Americans. It was the Americans, the British, the French, the Belgians even had a small regiment that had fled to England and that joined in the fight. So it was a multinational effort. This is the little town that they lived in and went back to. It's interesting, that church you see right there, that church is 1,033 years old. It was built, I'm sorry, it was 990 years old. It was built in 1033 AD, and it's still there today. They lived somewhere down this road, I'm not sure exactly where on this side. Their former home was not habitable, so my grandfather had been a gardener for a wealthy family that lived downstream a ways, and that family arranged for them to be able to stay in a small little hotel and tavern that was in Hastir. And here they are on the steps of that hotel. This is my mother, and this is my grandparents on the front steps of the hotel. That's a picture of the hotel today, the same exact place. I have several pictures like this. It's very interesting to just imagine there, and almost wish I could go and stand there just to feel it. But it's still there, as are many buildings in Europe many that weren't destroyed by the war are still pretty much the same as they were 75 years ago. They just last and last. So the German army desired that all the people come back to their country so that they could reestablish their economy and help in production of food and war supplies and things that they needed. But unlike sometimes what we imagine, maybe from our viewing television shows or whatever, they did not directly govern the people. They governed the people by establishing a military government, but the governments of the occupied countries continued to function subject to whatever rules that the military governments put in place. And this is similar to the way we do things in our army. We have a part of our army is called the Civil Affairs, and they are designed to be able to go into a country that we conquer and set up a civilian government and oversee a civilian government to maintain order and whatever. So law and order still in effect. Things to do with the public welfare and all that was still in effect, although restricted. Now, the reaction from the Belgians to this and other occupied countries was acceptance, but resistance. They did not like it, and we wouldn't like it either, but we would probably accept it. We would probably, well, this is the way it is, we're going to We're going to live under it, but we're not going to accept it. And there was also a very large measure of resolve among the people. They felt like we're going to get out from under this. This isn't going to last forever. And they were not willing to just knuckle under and totally cooperate. The German military had established a headquarters. They'd have little local headquarters, and as part of their civil affairs, they would have some officer that would be in charge of an area, and guess what? They set up their headquarters in the very same hotel that my mother and her parents were living. They occupied the bottom 2 floors, and my mother and I think another family or 2 were on the 3rd floor of that hotel. The Germans didn't bother them, didn't harm them in any way. They were polite. They sometimes even offered them extra food. That hotel had a dumbwaiter, and y'all know what a dumbwaiter is? A dumbwaiter is like a little elevator, except it's just big enough to put something in it, not a person. So they would put some food on trays and whatever on that dumbwaiter and send it upstairs, which they did. But my grandfather, being the person he absolutely refused to accept anything from them, and he never regarded them as anything but invaders and occupiers, and he just wouldn't have anything to do with it. So the families kept their distance, but they coexisted that way for at least a year, maybe 2. I'm not exactly sure of the timing. Now this will get some of you young folks excited here. What you see here is a German officer's dagger. They had different colored handles, and it was just like more of a ceremonial type things. But in fact, I think the German officers had to purchase it with their own money. But the commander of this that was based there in Hastir had one of these. And at some point, when they were about to depart that area, my mother stole it, and she hid it. And so they were frantically looking for it, wanted it very badly, questioned them, and searched all the area, but they never found it, and gave up and left without finding it. I'm surprised she didn't get in a lot of trouble, but she didn't. So she kept the dagger throughout the war until the liberation, after the liberation, she gave it to a friend of hers who had been in the Belgian White Brigade. So your question is, what is the Belgian White Brigade? Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you know where she hid it so successfully?
She said she hid it in an armoire, which would be a chest of drawers, and I'm not sure how come they didn't find it, but they didn't. She was feisty, there's no doubt about it. So the Belgian White Brigade was a resistance group that had been formed in 1940 after the Germans conquered Belgium. And many of its members were former Belgian policemen. They did things like publish an underground newspaper, would help recover Allied pilots that were shot down and get them to safety. They participated also in the protection of Jewish families and other things, including some violent resistance and whatever. But she had friends, and one of her friends had been a member of that brigade. I'm sometimes kind of surprised that my mother wasn't a member of it. This is a picture of my mother fishing on the Meuse River. You see the church right there. That's the church in Hastir. So we're upstream of the river, and she's on the opposite side of the river as her home. And when she talked about this picture, she told me, well, we had to do that because, food was being rationed. And it was. So there was food rationing in effect throughout all the occupied countries. Things like bread and sugar and meat and potatoes, and the staples were according to research I've done, 2/3 of what the German diet was allowed to be. So the average Belgian lost some weight. Now, they weren't starving, but they were definitely on a weight loss program. One of the benefits of the time, I suppose. So people could fish if they wanted to, and that's what she's doing. Take a look at that pole. That is one long fishing pole.
Do you know who took all these pictures?
No, I don't. She had some friends. There's a couple of pictures with those friends in the picture, but I don't know specifically which ones were taken by whom. There's something else in this picture. I took a section of it and blew it up. It's that bridge. And I wanted to talk about the bridge again because this is a different bridge than the one that was there before. Well, this is a bridge that the Germans built after they had overrun Belgium. And it's actually the second one because the first one would have been a pontoon bridge. A pontoon bridge is just a bunch of boats laid side by side across the river and then something to run vehicles over it laid over that. But this is a little more permanent bridge, so you can kind of see it. That helps date the picture. This bridge was then destroyed when the Germans retreated. And we built another. I actually have a little article someplace about our Army engineer unit that built the bridge when we were going after the Germans later. Bridges tell the story. Yes?
Could you tell the kids why that was necessary to build a permanent bridge structure over using a pontoon?
Oh, well, yeah. The question was, why was it necessary to build that bridge over the original or the pontoon bridge? Well, a pontoon bridge can be erected very quickly. We even have equipment that unfolds a bridge across a river, but a pontoon bridge could be erected in a day quickly by combat engineers, but you can't run boats under a pontoon bridge, right? So you have to build a bridge high with some clearance underneath it to get some boats under it. And that river was very important for transportation at the time. So a lot of material went up and down that river. When Mother was a younger child, somewhere between 12 and 13, she attended a school which it translates out to Daughters of Mary Institute. It's in Brussels, and this is a picture of what that school looked like. It's actually this whole compound here that you see. That's the same place today, same school today. That's the building furthest away. The reason I'm showing this is really to hopefully kind of inspire some of you younger kids that are in school. I selected 6 pages from a 60-page notebook that she had from that school, from her time at that school. And I hope you can see this clearly enough. This particular page deals with particles of speech, prepositions, infinitives, and participles. But take a look at the writing, how neat it is and how thorough it is. There's 60 pages in this book. This is one where they were studying about atmospheric pressure. You can almost translate that yourself, can't you?
What's the date at the top?
The date is 1937. The 3rd of March, 1937.
Was this school, did it have a specific, was it a general school for general studies, or did it have was it an engineering school, or a?
No, it was a grade school. It's still in existence, and it's still kind of a grade school. as best I know.
She moved there to Brussels for that?
She lived there. It's a boarding school.
So that kind of school wasn't available in her hometown?
No. But I'm just impressed by this. I look at it and I see the detail of it, and the subject matter really impresses me.
That wasn't the ballpoint pen, was it?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. This is a study of geography. So it's a map of Spain and Portugal. It's hand drawn. It's got the rivers on it. It's pretty accurate, actually. Here it's a little section covering geometry and trigonometry. It's a problem. This is an object, and she's to find the area of that object, and so she breaks it down into different sections and uses various formulas to calculate the area of that object. This one covers mechanics and levers and fulcrums and pulleys. So here's a fulcrum. Weight on one side, you're looking at how much, looking at the force required to lift that weight. Some pulleys here involved. Pretty neat. Economics, a little section on economics. This is it deals with percentages, and see here the word capital. Do you see that? How much capital is required to do this? So I thought maybe you little kids would enjoy seeing that. And a couple of things I want to point out about it. One is neatness counts, attention to detail matters, the mastery of the subjects is possible. You can learn this stuff. And that practical applications is the benefit. And every one of you kids can do this too. So when you do your work, put your full effort into it. Be neat, pay attention to details, and master the subject. It will be beneficial to you later in whatever occupation the Lord has in mind for you. You will be able to do well. Those things paid off for my mother in many ways later on. And later in her life, a little bit, I think, I don't remember the year, but she went to this school. This is a foundation, actually, that was created. Wealthy people put together money and opened this school, and then it later fell under a national government organization called, that really translates to the National Department for Children. So children's school and welfare type activities were unified under this organization called ONE. And that's where she went to school, nursing school. This is a picture in the yard. They've got the little kids out there and they're doing their daily exercise. A picture of her. That's my mother right there. And these are a few of her classmates. I believe that this is at the time that she graduated. I'm not 100% positive, but it's in May 1943. So you see, life was continuing on even under occupation. Now we're going to read about this lady here.
I have a question first.
Yes.
Sorry, going back.
Sure.
So she went to that boarding school during the occupation?
Yes. Well, no, the boarding school was prior to the war. That was 1930s, 36, 37, 39, somewhere in there.
Okay. So this nursing school was after that?
That's after.
Would that have been very difficult for her family to fund, seeing that they were in such tough conditions, or do you know anything about?
I don't know how it was funded.
Okay.
I don't know if she received some sort of scholarship or not. They did not have money,
Right,
so
right.
somebody else had to have paid for
Got
it.
it, okay.
They were not a wealthy family at all. But mother was a good student, so she may well have had some sort of scholarship. Yes.
I'm using up all my tokens, I know, but I'm not a handwriting expert. But I'm astounded at her penmanship.
Yes.
There was so much consistency, it looked like it was computer generated.
Yeah.
It has to indicate some level of discipline. Was she
Right.
a really disciplined person? Were they all? Were they just not in a hurry like we are today?
Well,
You can't write like that and not be intentional about it.
right. This is the way they were taught. It's not that my mother was, so great at it. This is what was expected if you went to school like that. You had to write. Penmanship was important. We've lost
long way
that,
from that, aren't
almost totally lost that now. We have computers. All right, so this organization that I mentioned before that provided oversight for all these children activities was headed by this lady, Yvonne Frederick Navajo. She was an amazing woman. She was very active in the relocation of Jewish children in kind of an underground resistance to avoid deportation. She did some really great things to help save a lot of Jewish people and to kind of resist the occupation where it involved harm to children and to the Jewish people. Well, young nursing students from the schools that were under her direction were recruited to help in that transportation or transfer of Jewish children. And my mother was one of the students that volunteered for that work. So the way that worked is that children were transferred from their own family to a host family. What does that mean? That means they were taken out of their home and put into someone else's home.
Local? Somebody else local?
Somewhere unknown to everybody else. So the idea was to save those children from deportation because the Germans almost immediately began the process of rounding up Jews and deporting them first to work camps and things like that, later more in the extermination of them. So the children were, the identity, rather, I should say, of the family that was giving up the children and of the family that was receiving the children was not known by the other. So once you gave up your children, you didn't know where they were, and they didn't know where you were.
Was that on purpose to try to
It was on
just,
purpose.
for what purpose, do you know?
Well, think about it. If you get caught and you get interrogated or tortured, you can reveal information. If you don't know the information, you can't reveal it. So the transporting agents that were young ladies like my mother, they didn't know either family or anything about it. They were given instructions on who they would pick up and how they would identify those people. And all they had to do was pretend that they were either a mother or a caretaker or some cover so that they could take the children and transport them, usually by train. My mother mentioned going by train quite a bit for that. So, and this kind of answers your question, in the event of a capture, then no single party could tell everything about the other party. They were given identification papers and some kind of code, and I tried to get her to explain that to me, how exactly that worked, but I never could get an answer. She would tell you little bits and pieces from time to time, but usually she would kind of choke up and get frustrated with it and say, well, that's all in the past, I don't want to talk about it anymore. So maybe next year you could have another round at it, get a little more, and then you could read and study and find out what you can, but never could get the entire story. So these children were being put into safe homes and kept there for the duration of the occupation to avoid being deported. And at the end of the occupation, when the country was liberated, they would try to reunite them. In some cases, the parents never came back, because they were gone.
Do you know, was there a limit to the ages of the children? Was it infants to 12 or
It would have been all ages.
all
yeah.
ages?
Right. There were about 4,000 Jewish children saved this way through this lady and all the people that worked in it. That's a picture of that lady. In 1965, she was awarded an honor that's called Righteous Among the Nations by the Jewish World Holocaust Remembrance Center. Very courageous woman. This is another interesting story that not one that my mother told me, but one that I read about. I find really, it illustrates her thinking. She was sent, or not sent, but going to pick up a Belgian courier, someone that had been parachuted in from Britain, and that courier was bringing in a bunch of diamonds so that they could use that to pay for the release of Jewish people, bribe the Germans to release Jewish people that they'd captured. And she had hidden this person under a blanket in the car. And as they were driving down the road, the full story says that she saw the blue flashlight of a German what amounts to a German military police checkpoint, and as she saw that, she stopped her car and had the guy get out and hide in the bushes, and then she proceeded on to the checkpoint. So the Germans checked out the car and didn't find anything, and in the process of that discussion, she said, "Well, I've got to go, and so she backed up the car down the road, so that, didn't want to go right in front of everybody, close to the spot where she dropped the guy off. He got back in the car, and then she went back to the checkpoint, and they gave her an escort to where she wanted to go." This is a story, a really documented story. And my comment to that is, not all fighters carry guns. You have some very brave people do some very brave things. All right, sometime, I think maybe 2 years into the occupation, the family moved to a place, a small little town just outside Namur. And in 1943, my mother started working for this nonprofit organization. The Elizabeth Cradle is what that kind of translates to. This is a couple of pictures of her working with little kids. This is just what she loved to do. This organization was also involved in rescuing as many Jewish children as possible. It's a view of Namur. There's a lot more of this picture than I have time to tell you about, but this is a bridge that goes across this Namur, or across the Meuse River, and up on top on the hill there is a big citadel. It's got a big amphitheater, and I actually have it's clips from a movie made of my mother and father walking along in that park up there later on. All right, so in 1944, the Allied forces landed in Normandy. We've all seen that, or heard about that. And they started their march through France and into Belgium and on to Germany. And this, I'm telling you this because it's important to understand this. August 18th, 1944, the Americans accidentally bombed downtown Namur, killing 300 people and destroying 2,000 buildings. They were targeting a bridge, but there's lots of rivers and lots of bridges, and the the precision of bombing was not what it is today, and this happens. And of course, that's terrible, and it upsets people, you know. Just the cost of war. By September and then in October, most all of Belgium had been liberated, so it didn't take too long. And then, of course, you guys have heard of the Battle of the Bulge, right? That happened in December of '44. The Germans made a counteroffensive. Where was that? The Ardennes Forest, the same place that they'd come through before. But they were beat back.
That was a bitter battle, though.
It was a bitter battle. It was. So by February 4th, 1945, Belgium was fully liberated by American, Canadian, British, and exiled Belgian forces. Now, can you imagine the joy these people felt when that happened after 5 years of being told what to do by the Germans? They must have really been happy beyond belief. But at the same time that they were happy, I also can imagine that they felt a lot of sorrow. They were probably sad for all that had been lost, for the family and friends, lives that turned upside down, property that was destroyed, the opportunity that had been lost, all the things that they had seen and the impact that had on their sanity. I mean, it was a bittersweet thing, I'm sure. Well, back to when the Americans were coming through, you know, as they moved forward, they established forward air bases because that way they could launch their reconnaissance flights and plan their bombing runs and things of that nature closer and closer to the enemy. So as they moved into Belgium, they established a small base like that near Namur, just outside of Namur. One day, my mother was in town at that time. She was working in Namur, commuting by bus to that other little town where they lived. And she saw an American soldier waiting for the bus, and it was raining. So as a gesture of kindness, she offered to share her umbrella with him. And she said that after that rascal kept showing up at that same bus stop. So what do you think that means?
Not your dad.
Can you guess? Yep. That's right. That was my father. And there they are together. They're actually touring that citadel that I showed you earlier. And it seems to run in the family, this kind of thing. Not exactly the same, but there are a lot of similarities. Okay, so my father, he served in the Army Air Corps. He worked on communication, navigation, identification system for bombers. And in his last few months, he did these flight calculations for the blind bombing raids that were made on Germany. That was a fairly new thing at the time. It allowed the bombers to fly much higher and avoid the flak and things like that, but it required some calculations that were mathematically difficult. And he happened to be pretty good at math, and because of his other training, he got selected to do that kind of thing. During the war, he was based in England, and then France, and then Belgium, and then Germany, and then back to Belgium, and then home. So he went home in 1945 after Germany was defeated, as did most of the troops. There were some occupying forces that were left. We even established a constabulary to help police the Europe, but most of the troops went home.
How long was he out of the States from like 45 backwards? Like how long was he gone?
I think it's just maybe around 4 years total.
How old was he when he went off, and where was he from?
Well, he grew up in a little town in Louisiana, Robeline, Louisiana. Let's see, he would have been 25 in 1945.
What year were you born, sir?
1948. Yes, sir. Okay, so my father, even in his last years, he used to like to tell the grandchildren, and Kim will probably remember this. He used to talk about friend or foe, the friend or foe identification system. He'd just go on about that forever. I probably don't realize it, but I probably do the same kind of. I yap, on and on about the things that I remember. But the friend or foe system was a system, an electronic system that allowed identification of airplanes so that you didn't shoot your own airplanes down. It could tell you, oh, that's an enemy airplane, or it's a friendly airplane. So things he did were kind of important. Now we move into Mother's final years in Belgium. My father's gone home. She's still in Belgium. So she still had to work, still had to provide for her parents. By this time, they were no longer working, so she was providing for them. What you see here, and this is a photograph, and I left it like this. You can't see the detail, but that's a mansion up on top of a mountain in the Ardennes forest near St. Aude. The family the mansion is named Le Soleil, and it's owned by the Fabry family. Fabry family. A very wealthy family. It had actually been built it looks like it's really old, but it had been built in the late 30s by another family and then bought by these guys. That's a close-up, and that's my mother. She's taking a glamour shot in front of the mansion. So after the liberation, my mother, she took a job here as a resident caretaker for the children of that family at this chateau. When I was there, she met a guy named Raoul Natchez, and he was a medical doctor, but also a Belgian war veteran. And this guy had been rounded up and taken to Germany in a prison camp, along with other Belgian soldiers. But he was pardoned, or paroled is the right word, paroled, I think about after a year, because he was a medical doctor and he could help, with the treatment of injured people and things like that. So they had let him out. But he was trying to form an organization with a couple of other influential and wealthy people to establish a federation to aid the prisoners of war. It's not like it is now. We have a Veterans Administration, but back then, veterans in a lot of countries didn't have anything. They lost an arm or a leg or were badly injured, and tough luck. There wasn't much to do. Maybe they got a small pension or something like that, but this guy wanted to establish a hospital to treat these people that had, especially the ones that had tuberculosis, and a lot of them did because of the conditions in the camp. So they finally did build a hospital near this mansion, right next door to it almost, and it was specifically to treat the veterans who had tuberculosis. And that mansion was later sold to that federation, and Raoul lived there until he died in 1993. Of course, the hospital is closed now. All those veterans are long gone now, and it has been replaced. There's a big Red Cross facility there now. But while my mother was there, this guy had wanted her to join in that effort and kind of help with the nursing staff of this facility. But my mother, I think, had some other ideas. So my mother and father, they corresponded after he left for home. At some point, and I don't know whether it was when he was in Belgium or when they were corresponding, but there was a proposal and there was an acceptance. They never told me exactly what took place. Yeah, that's right. 23 years later, another love-struck guy does the same thing. So my mother immigrated to America in 1947. She had to wait a while. It took 2 years to get a passport and a visa. Things are a little different now. And my parents were married 5 days after she got back or got here. And this is the church they were married in, but this is a painting that my mother made of the church in 1976. And I think she did a really good job. I actually have a photograph of this old church, and it looks very much like this picture.
Is that Louisiana?
That's in Louisiana. That's in Roebling. This was the Methodist Church of Roebling. This was when Methodists were still reasonable.
You think they had you think they had meat pies after the wedding?
I don't know. No, I don't know. I know that they went on a honeymoon in Alexandria, Louisiana, and stayed at the Bentley Hotel. That's what I know. So it was a little off subject, but I'm going to go ahead and share this with you guys because I think it's interesting. My mother went on to work for a doctor later on who had a nursing home. And I think it was 1957, maybe 56, 57 when she started working there. And this doctor, his name was Dr. Wink, he and his wife were in a car accident, and he was blinded for the rest of his life. And he got a dog. It was a boxer that he named Buster, I believe. And so he could use the dog, seeing eye dog, so he could get around. And he kept his business, and he kept on being a doctor. But he had to have someone to be his eyes for him and to work with him. So my mother kind of did that for him at this nursing home. So she later, within a few years of that, became the supervisor for that nursing home and ran that nursing home for him. So that's where my stories come of all the names of the old people that lived there that she would talk about, and every now and then she would take my sister and I there to visit them and to kind of cheer them up and things like that. So later on she opened a daycare center, surprise, surprise, and took care of children. Funny thing is about that is that the first year of operation of that daycare center, they rented and remodeled this 4-room school building where I had gone to grade school in the 6th grade. My parents were married 55 years. My father died in 2002. My mother lived to be 91. She passed away in 2014. One thing I can say about her, she had a servant's heart for children and old people. My maternal grandfather died in Belgium in 1944, before the war ended, 8 months before the liberation. He'd been saving a bottle of wine to celebrate the victory over the Bulge, but unfortunately he didn't get to drink it. I wished I could have known him. I bet he had some good stories too. My maternal grandmother, she immigrated to the U.S. in 1950, and she lived with us the rest of her life. She lived a long time. She never, this is some funny things about her, she never learned to speak English, but she read the newspaper every day and could tell you what was happening. She lived very quietly with us. She tended to the home. She raised chickens for eggs and used me as her slave to take care of the chickens in the chicken house. Yeah. She'd stay with New and I for a few weeks at a time in our early years of marriage. And they couldn't understand each other, but yet they could communicate real well. Interesting. She's the one that told me a lot of stories, and I wished I could have recorded them all. And that's it. Any last questions?
What was your mother's ability to speak English when she came to the States?
I don't think, I'm not 100% sure. It wasn't zero. My cousins, a little older than me, said that they would work with her and, walk through the little town, and they would talk and try to get her to talk. And my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, would call her on the phone, and they'd make her answer, so she'd have to talk. Little things like that. But she apparently learned pretty quick, and she was certainly fluent. She did have an accent, but she was very fluent.
Cho just sent me a text and asked.
Hold on.
Cho just sent me a text and asked if I would mention that she used to tell her that she crossed the ocean for those blue eyes, referring to grandfather.
That she did what? Say it again?
That grandmother used to tell Cho that she crossed the ocean for those blue eyes, talking about grandfather.
Okay.
Also, grandfather, when he used to talk about the friend and foe, I guess he was the into the calculations, but also a sort of mechanic in a way, because he would
Yes.
mount the
Yes.
devices onto the aircraft, and so he would tell funny stories about, it would be late, they'd be tired, planes would just roll up one after another, and they would quickly put it on. And he says sometimes, plane would roll up, and he'd turn around, the plane had rolled off, so
Oh, no.
occasionally. I don't know what their checkpoints were, but it was pretty fascinating. He did talk about that a lot.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Tried to teach French to any of your family, or was that something you just left behind? Adopted English?
No, I learned a good deal of French growing up. Probably a lot from my grandmother, because that's all she ever spoke. My sister went on to be a French teacher, and she's very fluent. And yeah, she's very good. I'm not. I mean, I learned things as a child, but I will tell this story about that. Then this will probably be kind of interesting. I could make do with French. So when I was in Vietnam, there were a lot of the French officials in the little towns that could still speak French, and so sometimes I would become a translator, an intermediate translator. We would go from Vietnamese to French, and then from French to English, and English to French, and French to Vietnamese. Now, I don't know what kind of chaos and confusion that resulted in, but I did do that a few times, and glad I could. But I'm not in any way, fluent in French at all.
That's why the war lasted as long.
Could be, yeah, could. All right, thank you very much.
Before you turn the microphone off or step away from the microphone, would you just, no, turn on the lights, please. Would you just repeat that phrase you began with one more time?
Oh. Le bon Dieu est très bon.
The good Lord.
The good Lord is very good.
The Lord is very good.
Right.
One more thing is that I don't know someone, which was the great grandmother, that Tweety and Cho do remember her, and they do have memories of saying a
Yes, yeah,
get those opportunities, but they, I think Tweety had it memorized for a long time. I don't know if
yeah,
he can still do it. but
that's right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So as we close out today, let's close out with this thought. It's the same thought we started and began with the last time. I can't say the phrase, but the good Lord is very good. And so Kim just mentioned Cho texting her from Toronto, and I think about Cho and Justin and their children. I'm looking around the room, and I see Eunice and Reagan and Kim and Corrine. And then I think about a rainy day and a girl with an umbrella and a young soldier standing at a bus stop. And I think the good Lord is very good in ways that we can't even imagine. And the same good Lord is overseeing the fabric of all of your lives as well. And so as you go, this is a harrowing tale of really difficult times. But the overwhelming conclusion is the good Lord is very good. What a blessing. Thank you so, so much, both for agreeing to tell the story, but just for your organization in telling it. And it really came alive, and I just really appreciate that. So let's close in prayer, and then we'll be dismissed.
Father, we do thank you for the story of your grace and mercy. And Lord, I'm glad right now we're not going through a hard time like that. I hope we won't have to. But if we have to, Lord, we know you'll be with us. And I'm so thankful the way you bring people together. It's amazing, kind of like Tony and Patty's story. And we've all got a story like that, like Alex Wright. Lord, you control our lives that way. You're overall, you're so brilliant. You're all omniscient. You know it all. You're omnipotent God. Help us to rest in that. Thank you for Patrick, Lord, being here. I prayed for many years for him and to come here. And I'm glad they're here. We're serving you together. What a blessing that is, Lord. Go with us through our lives. Help us to serve you with all of our might. Lord, help these kids listen to Patrick, that he told them to do the best they can and to be neat and complete in what they do. We don't want to be a lazy God. We want to be efficient, and we want to do, you said, whatever thy hand do, do with thy might. Because that's to your glory, God. Help us to do that.